What if I told you that the biggest stock market crash in history still hasn't happened, and that a best-selling financial author predicted it over 20 years ago? Imagine waking up one morning to see your retirement savings wiped out, your 401k drained, and the financial system shaking at its core. Sounds dramatic, right? Almost like the opening scene of a disaster movie. But according to Rich Dad's prophecy, this isn't fiction, it's a warning. A warning that most people will ignore until it's too late. Robert Kiyosaki doesn't just claim a crash is coming. He explains why it's mathematically unavoidable, who will be hit the hardest, and how ordinary people can protect themselves or even come out wealthier on the other side. This isn't your typical financial book full of complicated theories and jargon. It's a roadmap, a wake-up call, and honestly, it's a little scary. Kiyosaki believes that a massive financial storm will strike when the baby boomer generation begins pulling trillions out of their retirement accounts, money that must come out by law. And when that selling pressure hits the markets all at once, the system shakes hard. But here's the twist. While most people panic, a small group of prepared investors stands ready. They understand the rules of the game. They know where the opportunities hide in chaos. And they're not waiting for the storm. They're building their ark now. So if you've ever wondered why the rich seem to get richer during market crashes, or what you can do today to avoid becoming financial roadkill when the next big drop hits, this is the video you'll want to watch until the end. Because Rich Dad's prophecy isn't just a prediction. It's a blueprint for survival and for freedom. In this opening chapter, Kiyosaki explains that most Americans transition from traditional pensions, defined benefit plans, to defined contribution plans such as 401ks. This shift might seem like a technical detail, but Rich Dad considered it one of the most impactful events in modern financial history. Under the old system, companies guaranteed retirement income. Under the new system, individuals became responsible for investing and growing their own retirement funds, often with little financial education, emotional discipline, or strategic understanding. Kiyosaki describes Rich Dad's warning. When the baby boomer generation eventually retires, they will be legally required to withdraw their 401k funds. The government mandates these withdrawals through required minimum distributions, RMDs. That means trillions of dollars will have to be pulled out of the stock market over time. Rich Dad believed this would create downward pressure on the market and eventually contribute to a massive future crash. Chapter 1 doesn't claim the crash will happen immediately. It simply introduces the structural vulnerability created when a large population depends on investment-based retirement rather than employer-funded pensions. The chapter also highlights a deeper theme. Most people participate in the financial system without understanding the rules that govern it. Rich Dad stressed that relying on a 401k without understanding market cycles, taxation, or the long-term impact of mass withdrawals is extremely risky. Kiyosaki uses this chapter to remind readers that financial ignorance is expensive, and that changes in law often affect the financially uneducated the most. Another major idea in Chapter 1 is the concept of financial dependency. Under defined benefit plans, retirees depended on companies. Under 401ks, they now depend on the stock market, an unpredictable environment. Rich Dad believed this shift transferred risk from corporations to individuals, who were never trained to manage that risk. Kiyosaki also notes that financial advisors, employers, and government agencies often encourage people to just invest for the long term, a message he argues is incomplete and potentially dangerous. By the end of Chapter 1, the book lays out its foundation. A legal change created a structural time bomb. The masses are unaware of it, and future market conditions will be shaped by demographic behavior rather than just economic cycles. The chapter prepares readers to dig deeper into why Rich Dad believed these factors would one day converge into the biggest stock market crash in history, and why individuals need to understand the rules now, not later. Chapter 2 focuses on a specific legal change that Robert Kiyosaki believes fundamentally reshaped the global financial landscape. The introduction of ERISA in 1974, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, This law created the framework for modern retirement accounts such as the 401k. Kiyosaki explains that most people never learned what ERISA actually did, yet their entire financial future now depends on it. Before ERISA, retirement was dominated by defined benefit plans. These were traditional pensions in which employers guaranteed a set amount of income for life. Workers didn't need to be investment experts. The company and pension managers handled everything. According to Rich Dad, this model provided stability, but was expensive for corporations. Over time, companies wanted to reduce long-term liabilities, so ERISA opened the door for a shift toward defined contribution plans. Plans where the responsibility shifted from employer to employee. Chapter 2 breaks down how this change wasn't just administrative. It altered the behavior of millions of Americans. Instead of receiving guaranteed pensions, workers now had to contribute their own money, invest it themselves, and absorb the risk of market fluctuations. Kiyosaki emphasizes that most people were never given financial education to manage these responsibilities, making them dependent on financial advisors who often sold products, rather than teaching real financial literacy. A key point Kiyosaki stresses is that ERISA unintentionally created a massive, predictable funnel of money into the stock market. As millions of workers invested through 401ks, capital poured into Wall Street, strengthening the markets and contributing to the long bull runs of the 1980s and 1990s. Rich Dad viewed this long-term influx as artificial support, a kind of demographic-driven demand rather than true economic strength. However, if money flows in as people contribute during their working years, it must eventually flow out when they retire. This is where Kiyosaki connects ERISA to a future market crash. He explains that when baby boomers hit retirement age, they will be required by law to withdraw money from their retirement accounts. These forced withdrawals could reverse decades of inflows, potentially overwhelming markets with selling pressure. Chapter 2 also highlights a deeper structural problem. ERISA created a financial system dependent on the stock market's performance. When millions of Americans rely on market growth for retirement security, the entire country becomes vulnerable to market downturns. Kiyosaki argues that this dependence is a modern risk few people recognize. Rich Dad's perspective is clear throughout the chapter. Whenever government changes the rules of money, new winners and losers emerge. ERISA shifted responsibility to individuals who often lacked the training to handle it. Companies offloaded risk, financial institutions gained more influence, and ordinary workers became tied to the volatility of the market. By the end of Chapter 2, Kiyosaki reinforces the core message: a single law, largely unknown to most people, reshaped global markets and set the stage for a future crisis driven not by speculation, but by demographics and regulation. The chapter prepares readers to understand how this shift creates systemic pressure that builds over decades, eventually leading to the prophecy outlined later in the book. Chapter 3 shifts the discussion from laws and retirement systems to a more personal, practical theme: financial readiness. Robert Kiyosaki begins by recalling lessons from Rich Dad about the difference between the real world of money and the world most people are trained for in school. The chapter argues that traditional education prepares people for job security, but not for financial independence or the realities of a market-driven retirement system. Kiyosaki explains that the move from pensions to 401ks marks a fundamental change in what individuals must know to protect their future. Under the old pension model, the real world of investing was handled by professionals. Today, ordinary workers are forced into that world whether they are prepared or not. This chapter stresses that most people are financially unprepared because they were never taught basic principles such as how markets behave, how taxes affect investments, or how to evaluate risk. A major point in Chapter 3 is Rich Dad's distinction between financial literacy and academic education. Kiyosaki notes that many highly educated professionals are financially insecure because they rely on job income alone. He explains that the real world rewards people who understand assets, liabilities, cash flow, and market cycles, concepts rarely taught in schools. This disconnect becomes especially dangerous when retirement depends on personal investing. Without literacy, individuals are vulnerable to emotional decisions, bad advice, and market downturns. Kiyosaki also highlights the psychological side of financial readiness. Rich Dad believed that many people avoid learning about money because they fear making mistakes. This fear keeps them dependent on employers, financial planners, or government programs. In the real world, Kiyosaki argues, mistakes are unavoidable and often valuable. The people who succeed long-term are those who learn from small failures, rather than avoiding financial responsibility entirely. The chapter then connects this personal readiness to the larger theme introduced in the book, the future stock market crash. Kiyosaki explains that a system built on 401ks requires individuals to make investment decisions for decades. If most people lack the training to navigate volatility, the resulting panic during economic downturns can accelerate the severity of market crashes. Rich Dad repeatedly warned that when fear dominates the masses, markets behave unpredictably. Another important idea in Chapter 3 is that the real world rewards people who take initiative. Instead of relying on institutions, Kiyosaki argues that many workers still expect their employer, their financial advisor, or the government to take care of them. But the shift triggered by ERISA means that people must now take responsibility for their retirement outcomes. The chapter encourages readers to begin learning how money works before the coming demographic-driven pressures influence the markets. By the end of Chapter 3, Kiyosaki ties everything back to the book's central message. A major financial change has occurred. Most people don't fully understand it, and the real world of investing is harsher than what schools prepare individuals for. The chapter warns that ignoring these realities is dangerous, especially with the long-term structural challenges ahead. Financial education, personal responsibility, and proactive preparation are no longer optional. They are necessary for survival in the modern retirement system. Chapter 4 marks a turning point in the book. Here, Robert Kiyosaki explains the deeper mechanics behind why Rich Dad believed a major financial crisis was inevitable. The nightmare in the chapter title refers to the long-term consequences of shifting from employer-funded pensions to individual retirement accounts, consequences that most people still do not fully understand. Kiyosaki begins the chapter by describing how the retirement system was historically designed to provide stability. Under defined benefit pensions, retirees received steady income regardless of market conditions. The responsibility was on employers and pension fund managers to ensure that money was properly invested and protected. However, once 401ks became the dominant model, this stability disappeared. Individuals, not institutions, became the financial shock absorbers of the economy. The nightmare, according to Rich Dad, is not just that millions of individuals now bear the risk of investing. It is that the entire system becomes vulnerable to human behavior, specifically fear, panic, and emotional decision-making. Kiyosaki emphasizes that most people invest without understanding market cycles. When times are good, they feel confident. When markets fall, they often sell at the wrong time. This emotional volatility becomes a systemic weakness when retirement security depends on millions of inexperienced investors. Chapter 4 also introduces a key demographic component, the size and behavior of the baby boomer generation. Kiyosaki explains that this is the largest and most economically influential generation in U.S. history. Their participation in 401k plans created massive inflows into the stock market, beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s. Markets benefited from these contributions, creating an upward trend reinforced by demographic momentum. However, Rich Dad warned that the same demographic force that pushed money in will eventually pull money out. And withdrawals, unlike contributions, are not optional. Laws require older Americans to take money out of retirement accounts at specific ages. This means that once the boomers shift from contributing to withdrawing, the market will face sustained selling pressure. A significant part of Chapter 4 is devoted to the difference between long-term structural problems and short-term market events. Kiyosaki argues that most financial commentary focuses on interest rates, corporate earnings, or political events. But Rich Dad believed the real threat comes from structural imbalances, the kind created by demographic cycles and poorly understood retirement laws. These forces play out over decades and cannot be easily reversed by policy adjustments or market interventions. Kiyosaki also addresses the illusion of safety created by rising markets. Many people believe that long-term growth is guaranteed because they have only experienced markets during periods of sustained expansion. Rich Dad warned that this optimism is dangerous if it is not grounded in financial literacy. When retirees begin selling assets on a massive scale, optimistic assumptions can quickly collapse. By the end of Chapter 4, the book makes its message clear. The nightmare is not a sudden crisis, but a predictable, slow-building challenge rooted in demographics, legal changes, and widespread financial unpreparedness. According to Kiyosaki, understanding these structural forces is essential for anyone who wants to navigate the coming decades with clarity and control. Chapter 5 examines the idea that most people make financial decisions based on assumptions they rarely question. Robert Kiyosaki explains that these assumptions shape how individuals save, invest, and plan for retirement, often without realizing that many of these beliefs are outdated, inaccurate, or dangerous in a post-ERISA financial environment. Kiyosaki begins by pointing out that nearly every financial plan, from personal savings to government policy, is built on assumptions. These assumptions include beliefs such as the stock market always goes up over the long term, your home is your greatest asset, a 401k is the safest retirement plan, and working hard guarantees financial security. According to Rich Dad, relying on unexamined assumptions is one of the biggest risks in personal finance. One of the central themes of the chapter is that financial assumptions are often inherited rather than learned. People absorb them from parents, schools, employers, and financial advisors. But since the financial rules changed with the shift from pensions to 401ks, many of these old assumptions no longer apply. For example, the assumption that employers will take care of you in retirement is no longer valid. ERISA transferred responsibility to individuals, yet many still behave as if someone else is managing risk for them. Kiyosaki also explains that the financial services industry reinforces certain assumptions because they benefit from them. For instance, the advice to diversify and hold for the long term works well for institutions collecting fees, but may not adequately protect individuals during large demographic-driven sell-offs. Rich Dad encouraged Kiyosaki to constantly ask, who benefits from the assumptions you believe? This mindset reveals hidden incentives behind common advice. Another major assumption addressed in Chapter 5 is the belief that the baby boomer generation will retire smoothly without disrupting the markets. Rich Dad argued that this is unrealistic, as millions of boomers withdraw money to fund retirement, or as required by law. The selling pressure could destabilize the markets. Yet most financial planning models ignore this demographic reality and instead rely on historical growth averages that may not hold in the future. Kiyosaki highlights that individuals often assume they have plenty of time to prepare for retirement. Rich Dad rejected this mindset, emphasizing that markets change quickly and unpredictably. People who delay financial education or investment planning often end up reacting emotionally rather than strategically. These emotional reactions can lead to panic selling during downturns or blind optimism during bull markets. The chapter also challenges the assumption that simply earning a high income guarantees financial security. Kiyosaki argues that without financial literacy and proper asset allocation, even high earners can be vulnerable. Rich Dad taught that wealth is not measured by income, but by the strength of one's financial foundation and the ability to adapt to changing economic conditions. By the end of Chapter 5, Kiyosaki reinforces the importance of questioning every financial assumption, especially in a retirement system dependent on individual decision-making and market performance. The chapter prepares readers to recognize how unexamined beliefs can expose them to long-term risk, particularly as the structural pressures described earlier in the book continue to build. Chapter 6 addresses one of the core misunderstandings Robert Kiyosaki believes many people have about money. The assumption that participating in the market, usually through a 401k, automatically makes someone an investor. Rich Dad argued that this belief is not only incorrect, but also dangerous, especially in a retirement system where individuals must manage their own financial future. Kiyosaki opens the chapter by distinguishing between true investors and people who merely place money into investments. Most employees with a 401k fall into the second category. They contribute money because their employer encourages it, because it offers tax benefits, or because they are told it is the responsible thing to do. But as Rich Dad emphasized, this behavior does not reflect genuine financial understanding or strategic decision-making. A key concept in the chapter is control. True investors seek control over what they invest in, control over the timing, control over the risks, and control over how their money grows. In contrast, most people with retirement accounts surrender control to mutual fund managers, financial advisors, or automated systems. Kiyosaki explains that this lack of control creates vulnerability, especially during market downturns or future demographic-driven sell-offs. Kiyosaki highlights another important difference: education versus compliance. Many employees invest simply because they are told to. They follow preset choices on a 401k form, diversify according to generic advice, and hope the market continues its historical upward trend. Rich Dad warned that this set it and forget it mindset is not real investing. Real investors study the underlying assets, understand market cycles, analyze cash flow, and think critically about economic forces. Chapter 6 argues that the shift from pensions to 401ks created millions of accidental investors, people who hold investments but lack the knowledge to manage them. Rich Dad believed this creates systemic risk because emotional, uneducated reactions can amplify market volatility. When millions of inexperienced participants panic during downturns, their collective behavior can accelerate declines. Kiyosaki also critiques the financial industry for encouraging passive participation. He notes that many advisors use generalized advice like think long-term, stay diversified, or don't time the market. While these messages sound responsible, Rich Dad believed they oversimplify the realities of investing and discourage individuals from becoming truly financially literate. The chapter stresses that simplified rules may work in stable conditions, but can fail during periods of structural stress. Another major point is the difference between professional investors and amateur investors. Professionals seek opportunities, study markets deeply, build diversified asset classes beyond just stocks, and prepare strategically for downturns. Amateurs, on the other hand, often react emotionally, chase returns, follow trends, or rely on employer-recommended funds. Rich Dad encouraged Kiyosaki to focus on developing the mindset and skills of a professional investor, not merely to participate in the market like everyone else. By the end of Chapter 6, the book emphasizes that becoming a real investor requires intentional education, discipline, and control. Simply contributing to a 401k does not offer protection against the long-term structural risks described earlier in the book. The chapter sets the stage for upcoming sections where Kiyosaki explains how individuals can build the knowledge and systems needed to navigate markets proactively, rather than passively. Chapter 7 expands on a central argument in Rich Dad's prophecy. In the modern financial system, every individual, regardless of profession, income, or background, must become an investor. Robert Kiyosaki explains that this is not a motivational slogan, but a structural necessity created by the shift from pensions to defined contribution plans, like the 401k. Since retirement income now depends on market performance, people must understand how investing works or they risk becoming financially vulnerable. Kiyosaki begins by contrasting the old retirement model with the new one. Under traditional pensions, companies hired professional managers to invest on behalf of workers. Individuals didn't need to know anything about asset allocation, market cycles, or economic trends. Their retirement checks were guaranteed. But after ERISA changed the laws, responsibility shifted from institutions to individuals. Rich Dad described this transition as the biggest transfer of risk in the history of finance. Once this transfer happened, becoming an investor was no longer optional. It became a requirement for financial survival. The chapter stresses that most people did not recognize this shift. Many continued living with the assumption that steady employment and consistent savings were enough to ensure retirement security. Rich Dad warned that this belief is outdated. Without investment skills, individuals are exposed to market volatility, emotional decision-making, and long-term demographic pressures, especially the future so-oft expected as baby boomers withdraw retirement funds. A major focus of Chapter 7 is the difference between active investors and passive savers. Kiyosaki explains that passive savers follow instructions without understanding the underlying mechanisms. They invest through employer plans, assume the market will grow indefinitely, and rely on financial advisors for guidance. While this approach might work during long bull markets, it fails when large-scale structural risks emerge. Rich Dad insisted that everyone needs to develop the mindset and skills of an investor, not simply rely on automated investment options. The chapter also describes the psychological barriers preventing people from becoming investors. These include fear of risk, lack of financial education, and the belief that investing is too complicated. Rich Dad viewed these barriers as dangerous because they keep people dependent on systems that may not protect them during downturns. He argued that financial education is the antidote. By learning the basics of markets, cash flow, asset classes, and risk management, individuals can make rational decisions instead of emotional ones. Kiyosaki highlights that becoming an investor does not mean everyone must trade stocks or take high risks. Instead, it means understanding how money works and choosing investments intentionally. Real investors evaluate opportunities, control their decisions, and position themselves to benefit from market cycles. This level of engagement is necessary in a world where personal retirement funds are exposed to demographic shifts and regulatory pressures. By the end of Chapter 7, the message is clear. The financial environment created by ERISA and aging demographics demands that every working adult develop investor-level competence. The chapter sets the stage for the next portions of the book, where Kiyosaki shifts from diagnosing systemic problems to explaining how individuals can prepare, build financial resilience, and construct their own arc before the predicted market storm arrives. Chapter 8 identifies what Robert Kiyosaki and Rich Dad consider the root cause of the coming financial crisis: a fundamental misunderstanding of money, risk, and financial responsibility across the general population. While earlier chapters explain the legal and demographic forces behind the retirement system, this chapter focuses on the deeper behavioral and educational weaknesses that make the system fragile. Kiyosaki begins by emphasizing that the problem is not simply the existence of 401ks or ERISA. Those are structural factors. The real issue is that millions of people entered the world of investing without the mindset, training, or discipline required to navigate it. In other words, the system assumes people are financially competent, but in practice, most are not. Rich Dad believed this mismatch between responsibility and capability is the real source of long-term risk. A central point in this chapter is the concept of financial dependence. Even though the retirement system transitioned to defined contribution plans, most individuals still behave as if someone else is responsible for their financial future. They expect employers, financial advisors, or the government to guide them. This dependent mindset means people rarely question standard advice or investigate whether their retirement strategies align with economic and demographic realities. Kiyosaki explains that this lack of financial independence is rooted in the traditional schooling system, which prioritizes academic skills but neglects financial literacy. Students graduate knowing how to write essays and pass exams, but not how to evaluate investments, understand cash flow, or recognize market risks. Rich Dad argued that this educational gap sets people up for long-term vulnerability, especially in a system where individuals are legally responsible for managing their retirement funds. Another major theme of Chapter 8 is emotional investing. Rich Dad believed that emotions, particularly fear, greed, and complacency, drive most people's financial decisions. When markets rise, people assume they will continue rising, When markets fall, they panic and sell. This emotional volatility magnifies the systemic risks created by demographic shifts. If millions of investors react emotionally at the same time, market downturns can accelerate and become self-reinforcing. Kiyosaki also addresses the widespread assumption that markets will always recover, because they have in the past. Rich Dad warned that historical performance cannot be relied upon when the underlying system changes. The economic environment of the next 30 years will not resemble the last 30 years, especially as baby boomers transition from net contributors to net withdrawers. Yet most financial models still rely on historical averages, creating blind spots that could expose individuals to significant losses in the future. The chapter concludes by explaining that the real cause of the problem is a combination of structural, educational, and psychological weaknesses. Structural forces like ERISA place responsibility on individuals. Educational weaknesses leave people unprepared. Psychological tendencies lead to poor decision-making. These factors together form the foundation of a retirement system, vulnerable to long-term demographic pressure. By the end of Chapter 8, Kiyosaki reinforces the idea that a financial crisis is not the result of one event, but of a system built on flawed assumptions and unprepared participants. The chapter sets the stage for understanding how these risks compound, and why Rich Dad believed a major market correction is not only possible but inevitable. Chapter 9 brings together the ideas developed in the previous chapters and explains why Rich Dad believed a perfect storm was forming in the U.S. financial system. Robert Kiyosaki uses this chapter to connect demographic trends, structural changes in retirement laws, emotional investing behavior, and widespread financial illiteracy into a single, long-term threat that could destabilize markets. Kiyosaki opens the chapter by emphasizing that financial crises rarely come from one cause. Instead, they emerge when multiple forces converge at the same time. Rich Dad called this convergence the perfect storm. In this context, the storm consists of 1. The shift to defined contribution plans. 2. The aging of the baby boomer generation. 3. The legal requirement for retirees to withdraw from their retirement accounts, and for a population lacking financial education but heavily dependent on the stock market. One of the most important components is demographics. Kiyosaki explains that the baby boomers are not just another generation. They are the largest economic force in American history. Their entrance into retirement marks a turning point. For decades, they contributed to the market through their 401ks, pushing trillions of dollars into equities. But as they retire, the direction of cash flow will reverse. Instead of contributing, boomers will withdraw. Rich Dad believed that no market could absorb such massive selling pressure without major consequences. Another element in the perfect storm is regulation, particularly the rules governing required minimum distributions (RMDs). These rules force retirees to withdraw money whether they want to or not. Rich Dad warned that this legal pressure guarantees consistent selling from aging investors, even during downturns, accelerating volatility and limiting market recovery. Kiyosaki also highlights the psychological factor. Most individuals investing through 401ks don't behave like trained investors. They behave emotionally. When markets rise, they become optimistic. When markets fall, they panic. Rich Dad saw this emotional behavior as a major amplifier of structural risks. If millions of people who depend on the market for retirement start selling in fear during a period when demographic withdrawals are already pressuring the system, the result could be a cascading market decline. Another critical factor is financial literacy. Kiyosaki argues that most participants in the retirement system do not understand market cycles, risk management, or the long-term implications of demographic shifts. They rely on generic advice that may not account for the structural changes taking place. Rich Dad believed this lack of understanding would cause many investors to make poor decisions at the worst possible times, deepening the market's instability. Kiyosaki also explains that many professionals and institutions underestimate these risks because they rely on historical data, but the future will not resemble the past. The retirement landscape of the coming decades includes conditions that have never existed before: namely, a massive, legally mandated withdrawal wave. By the end of Chapter 9, Kiyosaki makes it clear that the perfect storm is not about predicting the exact timing of a crash. It is about understanding the long-term forces that will shape the market. Rich Dad's warning is that once these forces align, they can create a powerful, unavoidable downward cycle. The chapter concludes by urging readers to recognize these signals early and prepare before the storm becomes visible to everyone else. Chapter 10 marks the transition point in Rich Dad's prophecy from diagnosing the systemic problem to outlining the personal strategy individuals need in order to protect themselves from the coming financial storm. The chapter is built around Rich Dad's metaphor of an arc, a long-term financial structure designed to withstand major market disruptions. The message is clear: you can't stop the storm, but you can prepare for it. Kiyosaki begins the chapter by explaining why Rich Dad used the arc analogy. In Rich Dad's view, most people treat financial planning reactively. They wait for problems to appear before making decisions. But real financial security is created by anticipating risk and preparing in advance. The arc represents a proactive approach. Build before the rain, not during it. A central idea in Chapter 10 is that the financial environment has fundamentally changed after ERISA. Since individuals carry the burden of retirement risk, they cannot depend on employers, advisors, or the government to secure their future. Building an arc means taking responsibility for one's financial education, investment strategy, and long-term planning. Rich Dad believed this shift in mindset is more important than any specific investment. Kiyosaki then outlines the purpose of the arc: to protect wealth during a major market correction and position the individual to benefit when others are unprepared. Rich Dad viewed market crashes not simply as threats, but as opportunities for those who are financially stable, liquid, and educated. The arc provides that stability. Chapter 10 introduces the first components of the arc: financial intelligence. Rich Dad emphasized that knowledge is the foundation of the arc. Without financial literacy, understanding cash flow, assets, debt, taxation, and market dynamics, individuals cannot make informed decisions. Education reduces emotional reactions and helps individuals recognize opportunities that others miss during downturns. Control. Rich Dad believed that real investors seek control over income sources, control over assets, control over investment decisions. The arc must be built with assets and systems that the individual understands and manages, rather than relying on financial products controlled by institutions. Cash flow-focused assets. Another core idea is that real stability comes from assets that generate consistent cash flow, not just assets that appreciate. Cash flow provides resilience during market volatility and gives investors the flexibility to make strategic moves when asset prices drop. Long-term vision. Building an arc requires patience. Rich Dad taught that wealth grows through long-term thinking, not short-term speculation. Preparing for the predicted downturn means planning decades ahead, not reacting to yearly market fluctuations. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the arc is not a single investment or a secret tactic. It is a structure, a combination of education, mindset, and asset building meant to withstand demographic shifts and market downturns. By the end of Chapter 10, the book reframes fear of the future into strategic preparation. Rich Dad's message is that while the perfect storm may be unavoidable, individuals who build their arc early will not only survive it, but potentially emerge in a stronger financial position than before. Chapter 11 expands the arc metaphor introduced in Chapter 10 and turns it into a practical framework. Robert Kiyosaki uses this chapter to explain how an individual can actually build a financial structure capable of surviving and benefiting from the long-term market pressures described earlier in the book. Rather than focusing on specific investment products, the chapter centers on mindset, strategy, and the development of personal financial systems. Kiyosaki begins by clarifying that an arc is not a portfolio filled with random investments. It is a design system built deliberately, based on clear principles that Rich Dad taught him. Many people try to grow wealth by chasing returns or copying trends, But Rich Dad believed that true resilience comes from building a solid financial foundation long before a crisis occurs. The ARC is a structure that protects individuals from emotional decisions, market volatility, and sudden financial shocks. The chapter outlines the first principle of building an ARC. 1. Strengthen your financial education. Rich Dad emphasized that financial intelligence is the primary building material. Without understanding assets, liabilities, leverage, taxation, and market cycles, individuals end up relying blindly on advisors or popular advice. Kiyosaki stresses that financial education is not a one-time activity. It is continuous learning. The more you know, the better decisions you make, especially during market instability. The second principle is 2. Build a solid cash flow base. Rich Dad believed that cash flow producing assets form the foundation of any ARC. Assets that generate reliable income, such as businesses, real estate, or cash flow focused investments, create stability even during downturns. When markets fall and asset prices drop, cash flow gives investors the confidence and liquidity needed to act strategically, instead of panicking. Next, Kiyosaki explains the third principle. 3. Reduce dependency and increase control. Most people depend heavily on employers, advisors, or market performance for their financial security. Rich Dad viewed this dependency as a major weakness. Building an ARC requires gaining more control over financial decisions, income sources, and investment strategies. The less control individuals have, the more vulnerable they are during downturns. Control also reduces emotional reactions because decisions are based on understanding, not fear. The chapter then moves to the fourth principle. Use systems, not hope. Rich Dad taught that the average person relies on hope. Hope that the market goes up. Hope that their advisor knows best. Hope that past performance repeats. In contrast, professional investors use systems, clear criteria for buying, selling, evaluating risks, and managing cash flow. Systems reduce emotional decision-making and keep investors disciplined when markets become unpredictable. Finally, the fifth principle is 5. Prepare for volatility, not stability. Kiyosaki emphasizes that the ARC is built for the coming storm, not for calm conditions. Many investors plan based on long-term market averages, but Rich Dad warned that demographic shifts and mandatory withdrawals will create unusual levels of volatility. The ARC must be strong enough to withstand turbulence, which means building liquidity, maintaining cash flow, and avoiding over-leveraged positions. By the end of Chapter 11, Kiyosaki makes it clear that building an ARC is a process, not an event. It requires education, discipline, control, and long-term planning. The goal is not just survival. It is positioning oneself to thrive during the market transformation that Rich Dad believed was inevitable. Chapter 12 shifts from explaining how to build a financial ARC to the next essential step, taking control of it. Robert Kiyosaki explains that even if an individual has the right structure, assets, or systems, the ARC will fail if the person does not actively control its direction. Rich Dad believed that control, not luck, income, or market conditions, is the defining difference between financial survivors and financial victims. Kiyosaki starts the chapter by arguing that most people mistakenly believe they have control over their financial lives when they actually don't. For example, people with 401ks often think they are investing, but the reality is that they have very little control over the investment choices, management fees, tax treatment, or timing of withdrawals. Rich Dad taught that this illusion of control is dangerous, especially in a system facing long-term demographic stress. The first key concept in this chapter is self-responsibility. Rich Dad insisted that no financial plan works unless the individual takes responsibility for every part of it: income, expenses, investment decisions, risk exposure, and long-term goals. Many people delegate these responsibilities to advisors or rely on employer plans. According to Rich Dad, delegation without education leads to dependency, and dependency destroys control. The second major concept is control of financial information. Kiyosaki stresses that to control an ARC, a person must control the information that influences their decisions. This means learning to read financial statements, understanding the behavior of assets, monitoring cash flow, and recognizing market signals. Rich Dad warned that investors who rely solely on media headlines or advisor summaries will always react late to major changes. The chapter also highlights control of emotions, which becomes a formal theme in later chapters. Even the best-designed arc fails if the owner panics during downturns or becomes greedy during booms. Rich Dad believed that emotional discipline is a form of control that prevents people from making decisions driven by fear, impatience, or overconfidence. Another important form of control discussed in Chapter 12 is control over debt. Rich Dad taught that debt can be either a powerful tool or a serious vulnerability. Those who lose control of their debt during market shifts risk financial collapse. Those who control debt strategically, using it to acquire cash flow producing assets, strengthen their arc and increase its stability. Kiyosaki also explains control over timing. While no one can predict exact market peaks or crashes, educated investors can control when they buy, when they sell, and when they stay liquid. Rich Dad believed that timing isn't about predicting the future. It's about being prepared, disciplined, and positioned to act when opportunities appear. The chapter ends by reinforcing the central idea: the storm is unavoidable, but chaos harms most people because they never had control in the first place. Building an arc is the structural step. Taking control is the operational step. Both are necessary. Rich Dad's lesson is that financial independence emerges when individuals combine a solid financial foundation with personal responsibility, discipline, and informed decision-making. Chapter 12 prepares readers for the deeper layers of control covered in the chapters that follow. Chapter 13 begins the series of controls Rich Dad believed were essential for building and maintaining a resilient financial arc. The first and most fundamental control is control over yourself. Robert Kiyosaki explains that financial success is not primarily about intelligence, income, or investment strategies. It starts with personal discipline, self-awareness, and the ability to govern one's own behavior. Kiyosaki notes that most people think financial failure comes from external factors, such as market crashes, bad advice, or economic downturns. But Rich Dad argued that the true root of financial problems comes from internal factors: fear, doubt, impatience, greed, procrastination, and lack of discipline. If a person cannot control themselves, they cannot control their financial arc, no matter how well constructed it is. The chapter focuses on several dimensions of personal control. 1. Control of habits. Rich Dad taught that wealth is built on routine behaviors, not one-time events. Small habits, like budgeting, studying financial material, reviewing cash flow, or seeking new opportunities, accumulate over years. On the other hand, bad habits such as overspending, ignoring financial statements, or avoiding uncomfortable decisions weaken the financial foundation. Kiyosaki emphasizes that replacing destructive habits with productive ones is a core part of self-control. 2. Control of thoughts and beliefs. According to Rich Dad, people are often held back not by lack of opportunity, but by limiting beliefs. Common beliefs like investing is risky, I'm not good with numbers, or the market will take care of me prevent individuals from taking responsibility for their financial future. Chapter 13 stresses that mindset shapes outcomes. Those who believe they can learn and grow tend to build stronger financial structures. 3. Control of emotions. Although emotional control becomes a dedicated chapter later, Kiyosaki introduces it here as part of personal discipline. Money triggers powerful emotions: fear during downturns and greed during booms. Rich Dad believed that individuals who are controlled by emotions will make poor financial decisions. Recognizing emotional reactions and learning to respond rationally is a key form of self-control. For control of time and priorities, Kiyosaki argues that many people claim they want financial freedom but allocate almost no time to developing financial literacy or building income-producing systems. Self-control means managing time intentionally, dedicating hours to learning, planning, and strengthening one's arc rather than only reacting to short-term needs. Rich Dad often said that people who say they don't have time usually lack control of themselves, not their schedules. 5. Control of lifestyle choices. Rich Dad warned that many individuals sabotage their financial future by expanding their lifestyle as their income grows. Chapter 13 stresses that real investors prioritize building assets over increasing consumption. People who constantly upgrade their lifestyle become fragile. Those who delay consumption and strengthen their asset base become resilient. Kiyosaki concludes the chapter by reinforcing that all other controls are built on this one. Without self-control, strategies collapse under stress. With self-control, individuals can navigate uncertainty, resist financial pressure, and stay focused on long-term goals. This chapter sets the foundation for the additional controls that follow, demonstrating that every part of the arc begins with controlling the person building it. Chapter 14 expands on one of the most important and often overlooked principles in Rich Dad's financial philosophy: controlling emotions. Robert Kiyosaki explains that even if someone has the right financial plan, knowledge, and strategy, they can still fail if emotions dominate their decisions. According to Rich Dad, emotional control is not optional. It is a structural component of a strong financial arc. Kiyosaki opens the chapter by explaining that money is deeply emotional. People work for it, stress over it, argue about it, and often tie their self-worth to it. Because of this, financial decisions are rarely purely logical. Rich Dad emphasized that emotional reactions, especially fear and greed, are responsible for many of the worst financial outcomes. These reactions intensify during market volatility, making emotional control essential in the demographic-driven turbulence described earlier in the book. The chapter identifies several emotional triggers. 1. Fear of losing money. Rich Dad taught that fear is natural. Everyone feels it. The problem is not fear itself, but how individuals respond to it. Many people avoid investing, sell during downturns, or cling to job security because of fear. Emotional fear pushes them toward short-term safety at the cost of long-term financial growth. Rich Dad argued that investors must learn to act despite fear, not avoid situations that trigger it. 2. Greed and the desire for quick gains. Greed influences people to chase trends, jump into speculative investments, or believe unrealistic promises. During bull markets, greed drives herd behavior, making individuals believe that this time is different. Rich Dad explained that greed distorts judgment just as much as fear. Investors must control the urge to chase returns and instead rely on discipline and analysis. 3. Panic during downturns. Kiyosaki highlights that market crashes don't simply reflect economic conditions. They reflect collective emotions. When millions of inexperienced investors panic simultaneously, selling intensifies declines. This emotional amplification is one reason Rich Dad believed the retirement system is vulnerable. Controlling panic responses is essential for navigating the predicted perfect storm. 4. Euphoria during bull markets. Just as downturns trigger fear, rising markets trigger overconfidence. Many people assume that strong markets will continue indefinitely, leading them to overextend, overborrow, or overinvest. Rich Dad taught that emotional highs can be as dangerous as emotional lows. Controlled investors stay cautious even during good times. The chapter then shifts to how to control emotions, offering Rich Dad's practical insights. Knowledge reduces fear. The more individuals understand their investments, the less likely they are to panic. Systems reduce emotional decisions. Predetermined criteria for buying and selling help investors stay disciplined. Experience builds emotional resilience. Small controlled mistakes help individuals learn how to manage fear without catastrophic consequences. Cash flow provides emotional stability. Steady income from assets reduces anxiety during market downturns and allows investors to make rational decisions. Kiyosaki concludes Chapter 14 by emphasizing that emotional control is a decisive advantage. The coming financial storm will create extreme emotional pressure, and many investors will react impulsively. Those who maintain control will not only protect their financial arc, but also find opportunities. that others miss because they are overwhelmed by fear or driven by greed. This chapter reinforces that emotional mastery is a fundamental skill for anyone preparing for the structural changes ahead. Chapter 15 shifts from theory to application. After explaining the concept of the arc and the controls needed to manage it, Robert Kiyosaki uses this chapter to describe how he personally built his own financial arc. Based on Rich Dad's teachings, this chapter is practical, straightforward, and focused on the real steps Kiyosaki took to prepare for future economic volatility. Kiyosaki begins by emphasizing that his arc was not built quickly. It was the result of years of education, trial and error, disciplined habits, and strategic decision-making. Rich Dad taught him that wealth is created gradually through consistent actions, not sudden wins. The arc is a long-term structure, not a short-term tactic. The first major component of Kiyosaki's arc is financial education. He explains that his journey started with learning how money works, understanding cash flow, assets, liabilities, leverage, taxes, and market behavior. Instead of relying on traditional financial advice, he studied real estate, business systems, and investment strategies until he developed the ability to analyze opportunities independently. Rich Dad told him that education is the only asset no market crash can destroy. The second component is cash flow producing assets. Kiyosaki describes how he focused on building income streams that would continue regardless of market conditions. His primary vehicles were real estate investments and business ownership. Unlike a 401k, which depends on market appreciation, cash flow assets generate income even during downturns. This cash flow gave him stability, reduced emotional pressure, and allowed him to make strategic moves when market opportunities appeared. The third component of his arc is control. Kiyosaki chose assets where he had a high degree of control, properties he could manage, businesses he could operate, investments he understood deeply. Rich Dad emphasized that control is an advantage most mutual fund investors lack. By choosing investments he could influence, Kiyosaki reduced dependency on market fluctuations and institutional decision-making. The fourth part of the arc is leverage used responsibly. Kiyosaki acknowledges that he used debt to acquire assets, but only debt backed by strong cash flow. Rich Dad taught that debt magnifies risk or reward depending on how it's managed. Kiyosaki viewed responsible leverage as a tool to accelerate asset acquisition while maintaining safety margins. Another key component is liquidity and preparedness. Kiyosaki explains that he maintains liquidity so he is ready to buy when others are forced to sell. Rich Dad believed that every major downturn transfers wealth from the unprepared to the prepared. Maintaining liquidity through savings, cash flow, or access to credit increases a person's ability to act during a crisis. Finally, Kiyosaki highlights the role of systems. His arc isn't a random collection of assets. It's a structured system designed to function with or without market volatility. He built processes for evaluating deals, managing properties, controlling expenses, and reinvesting profits. Systems reduce emotional decision-making and ensure long-term consistency. Kiyosaki ends the chapter by reinforcing that his arc is not something unique or inaccessible. Anyone can build one, provided they commit to education, discipline, and long-term thinking. The lesson of Chapter 15 is that preparation is a deliberate practice, and the best time to start building the arc is before the storm becomes visible. Chapter 16 introduces Rich Dad's third control, controlling your excuses. Robert Kiyosaki explains that excuses are one of the most powerful and destructive forces holding people back from financial independence. According to Rich Dad, excuses operate quietly, often disguised as logical reasons, but they ultimately block learning, action, and progress, especially in a financial system that now requires individuals to take responsibility for their own retirement. Kiyosaki begins by describing how excuses function. They appear when people face discomfort, uncertainty, or the need to change long-standing habits. Instead of taking action, many people rationalize inaction. Rich Dad emphasized that excuses are not harmless. They create a mindset of limitation, reinforce dependency, and prevent individuals from building the financial arc. necessary to withstand future economic volatility. The chapter identifies some of the most common excuses Rich Dad encountered. 1. I don't have the time. Kiyosaki explains that this is one of the most common and misleading excuses. Everyone has the same 24 hours, and Rich Dad believed the real issue is not time, but priorities. People have time for entertainment, consumption, and routine work, but they rarely allocate time for financial education or asset building. Rich Dad taught that controlling time begins with eliminating this excuse. 2. I don't have the money. Rich Dad rejected this excuse completely. He taught that most investors start without much money. The point is to begin small, think creatively, and learn how to acquire assets through knowledge, partnerships, or strategic leverage. Saying I don't have money shuts down problem solving. Rich Dad preferred the question, how can I afford it, which opens the mind to solutions. 3. Investing is too risky. Kiyosaki explains that people misuse the concept of risk to justify inaction. Rich Dad believed that lack of education, not the investment itself, is what makes something risky. Avoiding investing because of fear leaves individuals dependent on job income and vulnerable to economic shifts. Controlling excuses means understanding that education reduces risk more effectively than avoidance does. 4. I don't know where to start. Kiyosaki acknowledges this as a real concern, but emphasizes that it is solvable through consistent learning. Rich Dad warned that many people use uncertainty as a permanent justification for never beginning. The only way to overcome uncertainty is to take small, deliberate steps forward. The chapter also explains why excuses are dangerous in the context of the coming financial storm. As demographic pressures increase and markets become more volatile, individuals who delay preparation will be the most vulnerable. Excuses prevent people from building the cash flow, savings, and financial skills they need before volatility hits. Rich Dad believed that excuses create long-term financial fragility. Kiyosaki highlights that controlling excuses is not about guilt, it is about responsibility. Rich Dad urged him to observe his own thoughts and question whether each excuse served his long-term goals or protected short-term comfort. This form of self-awareness is crucial for anyone trying to build a resilient arc. By the end of Chapter 16, Kiyosaki reinforces that excuses are the internal barriers that stop people from acting, even when the external opportunities exist. Mastering this control ensures that individuals take consistent action, confront discomfort, and make progress toward financial independence. Controlling excuses is ultimately about overcoming resistance and building the foundation necessary to navigate future economic challenges. Chapter 17 focuses on the fourth control in Rich Dad's framework, controlling your vision. Robert Kiyosaki explains that vision, the ability to see ahead, think long-term, and maintain clarity during uncertainty, is one of the defining traits that separates successful investors from those who struggle financially. In a retirement system facing demographic pressures and structural shifts, a strong and disciplined vision becomes essential. Kiyosaki begins by highlighting the role of vision in decision-making. Most people base their financial choices on short-term pressures, bills, job concerns, market news, or fear of volatility. Rich Dad believed this short-term mindset leads to reactive behavior, which becomes especially dangerous during market downturns or periods of economic change. Vision provides direction and prevents people from being swayed by short-term noise. The chapter emphasizes that vision is not about predicting exact events, such as the specific timing of a market crash. Instead, vision refers to understanding long-term trends, anticipating future needs, and positioning oneself to benefit from changes rather than be harmed by them. Rich Dad taught that individuals who develop vision are less likely to panic because they see beyond immediate circumstances. Kiyosaki outlines several components of controlling one's vision. 1. Long-term thinking. Rich Dad stressed that real investors plan decades ahead. The shift from pensions to 401ks, the retirement of the baby boomers, and mandatory withdrawals are long-term forces. A strong vision allows investors to prepare early instead of reacting when problems finally arrive. 2. Seeing opportunities before others do. Vision allows individuals to identify emerging trends, mispriced assets, or market inefficiencies. During a downturn, most people focus on losses, while those with vision focus on potential opportunities. Rich Dad believed that the biggest wealth transfers happen when visionaries act, while others hesitate. 3. Filtering out distractions. Kiyosaki explains that financial media, short-term predictions, and emotional opinions often distort people's perception of reality. Those without vision become confused or reactive. Rich Dad insisted that clarity comes from studying facts, understanding fundamentals, and staying focused on long-term goals rather than headlines. 4. Building a personal plan. Vision requires a plan that aligns with one's values, risk tolerance, and long-term objectives. Without a plan, individuals drift from investment to investment, following trends or reacting emotionally. A clear vision helps guide decisions even when markets fluctuate sharply. The chapter also connects vision to the metaphor of the ark. An ark is not built during a storm, but in anticipation of one. Rich Dad believed that only those with strong vision can commit to building their financial ark early. Most people wait until problems become visible. By then, it is too late to prepare effectively. Kiyosaki explains that vision provides emotional stability. When individuals know where they are going and why they are making specific financial decisions, fear and doubt have less influence. Vision also helps investors remain patient, avoid impulsive moves, and stay disciplined during uncertainty. By the end of Chapter 17, Kiyosaki reinforces that controlling one's vision is not optional in the modern financial environment. With major structural changes ahead, individuals need clarity, foresight, and purpose. Vision empowers them to prepare early, act intelligently, and stay aligned with long-term financial goals, regardless of market noise or emotional pressure. This chapter prepares readers for the remaining controls necessary to complete and maintain a resilient financial arc. Chapter 18 covers the fifth essential control in Rich Dad's framework: control over the rules. This chapter focuses on a key idea in Robert Kiyosaki's philosophy, that wealthy and financially secure individuals understand, use, and even design the rules of money, while the average person simply follows them without question. In a financial world reshaped by ERISA, 401ks, and demographic pressure, knowing the rules is no longer optional. It is a requirement for survival. Kiyosaki begins by explaining that every financial system operates based on rules, tax laws, investment regulations, retirement distribution requirements, accounting standards, and even informal social norms about saving and spending. Rich Dad taught him early that most people never study these rules. They accept common advice: put your money in a 401k, save for the long term, diversify, and hope for growth, without understanding the mechanics or implications behind these recommendations. The chapter emphasizes that those who understand the rules gain advantages, while those who ignore them become vulnerable. For example, tax laws often reward investors and business owners, not employees. Retirement laws determine when money must be withdrawn, not when it is convenient for the individual. Market rules influence how assets are priced, how liquidity behaves, and how institutions operate. Rich Dad believed that ignoring these rules is like playing a game without knowing how to score points. Kiyosaki stresses that controlling the rules does not mean breaking them or manipulating the system. Instead, it means understanding them deeply enough to operate intelligently. Rich Dad encouraged him to continually study tax codes, corporate structures, and investment regulations because these rules dictate how money flows. An investor who understands the rules can position assets more effectively, reduce liabilities, and avoid costly mistakes. The chapter also highlights several categories of rules individuals must learn to control. 1. Tax rules. Rich Dad taught that taxes are one of the largest expenses in most people's lives. Investors and business owners legally reduce taxes through depreciation, deductions, and corporate structures. Employees who rely on wages and 401ks often pay the highest rates because they don't control how income is categorized. 2. Retirement rules. ERISA and the IRS define how retirement savings are handled. Required minimum distributions are MDs force withdrawals at certain ages, regardless of market conditions. Understanding these rules helps investors avoid unnecessary penalties and prepare for demographic-driven market pressure. 3. Legal and corporate rules. Kiyosaki explains how corporations, LLCs, and partnerships allow investors to separate personal risk from business risk. Rich Dad taught that understanding legal structures is a form of financial protection. For market rules, markets operate based on liquidity, supply and demand, institutional behavior, and economic cycles. Knowing these rules helps investors avoid emotional mistakes and anticipate how markets react under stress. By the end of Chapter 18, Kiyosaki reinforces that controlling the rules doesn't require being a lawyer or accountant. It requires curiosity, continuous learning, and a willingness to study how money actually works. Rich Dad believed that those who master the rules position themselves for long-term resilience, while those who follow blindly are at the mercy of a system they don't understand. This chapter sets up the next controls, which continue building the foundation of a fully self-governed financial arc. Chapter 19 focuses on the sixth control in Rich Dad's system: control over your advisors. Robert Kiyosaki explains that while advisors can play an important role in a person's financial life, most individuals rely on them incorrectly, often giving away too much power, taking advice blindly, or failing to understand the motives, limitations, or incentives behind the guidance they receive. Rich Dad believed that controlling one's advisors is a form of self-protection and a key component of building a resilient financial arc. Kiyosaki opens the chapter by stating that most people are trained to defer to authority figures, such as accountants, financial planners, attorneys, and brokers. This deference is based on trust, but trust without verification creates vulnerability. Rich Dad taught that many advisors are employees within a system that rewards product sales, asset management fees, or institutional goals, not necessarily the client's long-term financial independence. A core principle in this chapter is that you must be more educated than your advisors in the areas that affect your financial future. This does not mean having more technical expertise, but rather having enough financial literacy to evaluate advice critically. Rich Dad emphasized that the role of an advisor is to inform, not to control, and the only way to maintain control is to understand the context and consequences of the recommendations being offered. The chapter identifies several common problems people face with advisors. 1. Advisors who sell products rather than strategies. Kiyosaki explains that many advisors are compensated not for helping clients build wealth, but for guiding them into packaged financial products such as mutual funds, annuities, or retirement plans. Without understanding this incentive structure, clients may receive advice that benefits institutions more than themselves. 2. Advisors who assume markets always rise. Rich Dad warned that many advisors operate under the assumption that long-term historical market averages will continue unchanged. This assumption becomes dangerous in the context of demographic shifts and mandatory retirement withdrawals. Advisors who ignore these structural issues may provide guidance that is misaligned with future market realities. 3. Advisors who encourage dependency. Some advisors intentionally or unintentionally teach clients to rely on them for every decision. Rich Dad viewed this dependency as financially harmful. Investors must learn to think independently, even when using expert input. For advisors who lack real-world investor experience, Kiyosaki highlights that many advisors are not investors themselves. They may have credentials or degrees, but lack practical experience in building cash flow assets, managing leverage, or navigating downturns. Rich Dad believed that advice should come from those who have done what they teach. Kiyosaki then outlines Rich Dad's guidelines for controlling advisors. Be financially educated enough to question advice. Choose advisors who align with your goals, not institutional agendas. Seek advisors who are active investors, not just credentialed professionals. Use multiple advisors for different specialties, avoiding over-reliance on one voice. Retain final decision-making authority at all times. By the end of Chapter 19, Kiyosaki reinforces that advisors should be part of the arc, but they should not steer it. The individual must remain the captain. Advisors offer tools and information, but without personal financial intelligence and clear long-term goals, even the best advisors cannot build financial security. This chapter prepares readers for the final control in the series, completing the framework for managing a strong financial arc. Chapter 20 presents the final control in Rich Dad's framework, control over your time. Robert Kiyosaki explains that time is the most valuable asset an investor has. Yet it is also the asset most people manage poorly. In the context of the coming financial storm and the long-term pressures created by demographic shifts, controlling time becomes a strategic advantage. Kiyosaki begins by highlighting a basic reality. Everyone has the same 24 hours in a day, but the way those hours are allocated determines financial outcomes. Rich Dad stressed that most people spend their time reacting to urgent tasks rather than investing in activities that build long-term stability. This reactive approach keeps individuals stuck in cycles of financial dependence, job insecurity, and emotional stress. One of the first concepts in the chapter is the difference between urgent and important work. Urgent work includes job demands, bills, errands, and short-term responsibilities. Important work includes financial education, building assets, reviewing investments, and developing systems, activities that strengthen the financial arc. Rich Dad taught that people who never reserve time for important work eventually lose control over their financial future. Markets change, rules change, and life changes, but without preparation, individuals are left exposed. The chapter explains that controlling time is directly linked to financial freedom. Investors who set aside time for learning, planning, and evaluating opportunities build better long-term systems. Those who claim they don't have time usually lack control, not availability. Rich Dad believed that this excuse is a symptom of deeper issues: fear, procrastination, and lack of priorities. Kiyosaki also describes how control over time protects individuals during market volatility. When people are rushed, stressed, or overwhelmed, they make emotional decisions, buying too late, selling too early, or ignoring critical information. Time pressure leads to reactive behavior, which is especially dangerous during market downturns or the demographic-driven withdrawal cycles predicted in the book. By controlling time, investors create the mental space needed for rational decision-making. Another major point in Chapter 20 is the role of systems and routines. Rich Dad taught that controlling time does not mean micromanaging every minute. It means establishing routines that ensure consistent progress, regular study sessions, frequent financial reviews, periodic investment evaluations, and intentional planning. These routines compound over years, strengthening the arc regardless of external market conditions. The chapter also highlights the importance of allocating time to build multiple income streams. Rich Dad believed that relying on a single paycheck or a single investment is risky, especially in an aging economy. Investors must deliberately dedicate time to developing cash flow producing assets, whether in business, real estate, or other fields. Without committed time, these opportunities remain theoretical rather than practical. Kiyosaki concludes the chapter by reinforcing that time, not money, is the real foundation of financial independence. Money can be lost and regained. Time cannot. Those who control their time gain the ability to learn, adapt, and build systems before the storm arrives. Those who let time slip away remain vulnerable, reactive, and unprepared. Control over time completes the 7-control framework, giving individuals the tools to maintain and strengthen their financial arc. In preparation for the long-term challenges ahead, Rich Dad's prophecy lays out Robert Kiyosaki's long-term warning: the U.S. retirement system, reshaped by ERISA and the rise of 401ks, has created a structural time bomb. For decades, baby boomers pumped money into the stock market through retirement accounts, fueling massive growth. But Rich Dad argued that the same demographic force will eventually reverse. And when boomers retire, required withdrawals will trigger sustained selling pressure the markets are not prepared to absorb. The book explains that this problem is bigger than market cycles or economic news. It's rooted in three deep issues: a retirement system that shifted risk from companies to individuals, a population with low financial literacy, and emotional investing behavior that amplifies volatility. Kiyosaki emphasizes that most people mistakenly assume long-term market averages will save them. But the future won't resemble the past once demographics shift. Instead of predicting dates, the book focuses on helping individuals prepare. That preparation is framed as building an arc, a personal financial system designed to survive and benefit from major disruptions. The arc is built through 7 layers of control. Control over yourself, emotions, excuses, vision, rules, advisors, and time. Each one reinforces financial independence, strategic thinking, and proactive preparation. Kiyosaki's message is that investors who rely blindly on traditional retirement plans are exposed, while those who build cash flow assets, maintain liquidity, and strengthen their financial intelligence will be positioned to navigate and potentially capitalize on future downturns. If you want to stay ahead of the retirement wave, protect your future, and build real financial independence, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what part of Rich Dad's warning hits you the hardest? More book breakdowns, financial insights, and wealth building strategies are coming next. Let's build your financial arc together.